Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, Television for Agricultural Business Decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs talks about negative margins in the cattle feeding sector. Nathan Mueller shows how you can estimate soybean yields before harvest. Aaron Berger discusses sampling forages this fall. And Bob Wright explains how growers can prepare their bins for harvest. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. USDA data released last week shows U.S. beef and veal exports for the month of July were down almost 13% from July 2014. And of the U.S.'s top 5 buyers, only South Korea imported more product than a year ago. Shipments to the biggest importer, Japan, were down 23%. U.S. imports, meanwhile, were up nearly 10% from July 2014, with double-digit percentage increases from Australia and Mexico and a triple-digit percentage increase from Brazil. For the domestic consumer, prices continue to escalate. All fresh retail beef reached a new high in July at $6.16 per pound. When we talked with Mike more than a month ago, he said feedlot operators were experiencing huge losses. We started our conversation with him Wednesday morning by asking if those margins got any better in August.
No, they've gotten worse. We've gone in about a 1 year period of time from record winners to record losers as far as profitability, and it's very tough right now. And I don't see that going away here for a little bit.
Because?
Everybody held that we've been overfeeding our cattle, and we've done it because your cost of gain was 70 or 80 cents and you're getting $1.50. Well, now you're getting $1.40, and it just keeps, and now the discounts have started to show up. The packers have started to discount cattle because we've held them too long because we didn't like the price, and now these cattle have gotten too big, so now discounts have shown up. So that's when you really know you've got a problem, when the packers are allowed to discount you when you've got supplies of fat cattle this low. This is a bad situation right now.
We saw prices really erode towards the, well, in August, but really towards the last of August. At any point here, do you say this is the low?
I think we've kind of gotten there, but until we get rid of all these big cattle, everybody knows we're going to be short cattle October, November, December. Everybody's known it for a long time, and everybody just keeps waiting for that rally to sell these cattle. Well, until we have what we've always had to have when we've gotten cattle too big, the big puke, where everybody finally gives up and gets rid of their cattle, this thing's not going anywhere.
So you see maybe late fall until prices really start to try and gain some traction?
No, I still think we're going to be short cattle in October, but you've got several weeks, or at least a couple weeks, where you've got to get these big cattle gone and get this thing out of here. The packers have done an absolutely amazing job, in my mind, of building inventory. Right now, if you were to sell an animal, he's not going for 2 or 3 weeks. They've been able to build inventory through this entire decline, which is just amazing to me when you figure you're harvesting 20,000 head less a week than you were last year, and they've been able to build inventory so they don't have to chase the market up on themselves. So until you actually get rid of these big cattle and actually realize the lower supplies of cattle, it's not going anywhere.
Do buyers seem willing to continue to place cattle in the feedlot though?
Oh, absolutely not. Margins, feeder fat swap is terrible. You're talking about cattle that lose 100, 150 bucks a head if you want to buy feeder cattle right now. So that's not going to change either. And I think what changes that is dramatic feed yard losses that we're having right now and will continue to have, like I said, until we get rid of the big puke of cattle. And then people adjust their thought patterns on what they're buying.
Those losses in the feed yard, Mike, eventually they have to go back to the producer, the cow-calf producer.
It all slides downhill, yes. I think there's going to be a massive adjustment probably this fall in the feeder cattle price and the feeder fat swap, basically, because I think there's going to be a good supply of feeder cattle this fall, and people are not going to be very aggressive because of the losses they've had. So I think you're going to see a change in that coming real fast towards the rancher.
Do you think there was a big bump in consumer demand over the summer for beef?
No, I think it went entirely the other way, because if you went to the store, pork was almost free. The discrepancy between beef and pork was so wide that we lost a lot of consumer demand. We got prices way too high last year, and they stayed high. Now, the one and only good thing about that, if you want to call it good, is the retailer has a tremendous margin right now, and he's replacing that high-priced product with really inexpensive product, probably the least expensive products he's bought in over a year. So he's got a good margin, and most beef moves on features. Well, now that he's got a margin, he'll be able to feature it. So I think the consumer will see some outstanding prices going through the fall, so hopefully we can bring some demand back. The other thing I hope is that our dollar calms down a little bit. I mean, it's good that we have a high-priced dollar, but it really hurts our exports. So if you tame that a little bit, I think you'll see exports come. So that could be a support to prices once we get out of this pit we're in right now.
Yeah, exports, they haven't been good.
No,
Do you think they
not.
could be any worse, though?
I don't think they'll get any worse. Typically this time of year you start to see exports track higher anyway, so hopefully we'll be okay there.
All right, any salvation from corn prices?
Oh, I think there's going to be a big salvation from corn prices. We're going to get another crop report here pretty quick. I thought the last time in the August crop report that was going to be our high crop. Well, you've seen weather continue to be excellent all throughout, so I think crops have gotten that good or better. And I think there's going to be a lot of price pressure on corn, especially when you've got oil low, so you don't have a real great thing going there in ethanol, so there takes out of demand. I think that's going to be a real saving grace for feed yards going forward.
If that's wrong, what price makes you nervous? Above 4?
Above 4 would make me nervous. You know, kind of that 320, 380 thing, I think it's going to be really hard to get corn over 4 unless some outside influence that I'm unaware of happens.
Next week, John Moret from J.E. Moret Grain Company will join us to look at corn and soybean markets and the USDA's September crop report. The latest USDA crop progress report lists 73% of Nebraska's soybeans in good to excellent condition, 1 point lower than last week. 21% of the crop is dropping leaves, 12 points ahead of the state's 5-year average and 3 points better than the national average. September's crop report released after this taping will provide an updated look at yields, but the August estimates projected Nebraska would achieve the best yield in the nation and the highest on record in the state. While those numbers are statewide, there are ways for you to get a better idea of individual field yields before harvest. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Nathan Mueller about the process of estimation at this time of the year.
Yeah, the first thing you do is the time of year, I think. It's best to do it at the end of August, beginning of September, when you're at that R6 full seed stage. That way you know what you have for pods, and you also know kind of how are those pods going to fill out, are all the seeds in those pods going to fill out. So the first thing to do when you get to the edge of the field is obviously get beyond the end rows, and then walk at least another 60 feet, just so the planter's operating at what I would consider normal. And then once you get to that spot, one thing is to determine how big of area to cut. And the easiest way I found in soybean yield, estimating soybean yield, is 1/10,000th of an acre. So a little bit different than corn, where we're doing 1/1000th of an acre. So you can essentially divide 627.26 divided by your row spacing. So for this field that's 30 inches rows, it's a 21-inch segment that we're going to cut with the pruning shears. So that 21 inches, that's your 1/10,000th of an acre. If you're 15-inch rows, that would be 2 21-inch segments. So you do side-by-side rows, and that's your 1/10,000th of an acre to estimate soybean yield on.
All right, so then you cut them off and took them back to the pickup. What's the next step?
The next step is to determine total pods in that 1/10,000th of an acre. We're really not worried about how many pods are on each plant, because we know soybeans compensate a lot on how many pods are on a plant. On the yield estimate we did, it ranged anywhere from 9 up to 49 pods per plant, so getting an average is kind of hard. Since soybeans flex, we look at how many pods are in an area, so that's what we count. It's easier to do that by plant, but count all the pods. We had 346 pods in this field in that 1/10,000th acre. Next is to pick 2 random plants out of that set of plants. We had 10, 2 out of those 10, to figure out how many seeds are in each pod. Now you could just assume 2.5 seeds per pod is average, but on the yield estimates I did this season last week in Dodge County was anywhere from 2.3 seeds per pod to 3. So that's a pretty big range and can affect yield quite a bit. So picking 2 random plant and counting how many seeds are in each pod.
You said one of the benefits of doing it at this growth stage is knowing which soybeans have filled out and which ones didn't, which you could have gotten thrown off on earlier in the season.
Yeah, if you're doing it early in the season at R5.5 where you still have some seed cavities that you think might fill, you know, this late in the game where we're R6, R6.5, we know if all those seeds are going to fill. So when we looked at some pods, there's a 2-pod cavity where there's seeds in each, or there's a 3-pod cavity pod, and only 2 of those 3 seeds filled. And that's what we can estimate or do a better job of estimating, waiting a little bit longer and doing our yield estimates.
Frankly, you don't care how many plants are there. You're only caring about pods, right?
Nope. I just want to know how many pods are per area because we know soybeans flex a lot on how many pods are on a plant.
All right, so like you said, 346 pods, 2.6 seeds per pod.
Correct.
You do what with that to determine the final yield?
Yes, the final answer is take those 2 numbers, multiply by each other, and divide by 18. And 18 is a conversion factor to count in seed size. And that 18 correlates with 3,000 seeds in a pound, which we're going to assume that we got normal seed size this year with the weather we've had. And that will give you your bushels per acre, which is 50 bushels per acre with those numbers in this field. Now the final step is, okay, we have 50 bushels per acre, but we know that we probably aren't going to harvest the beans at 13%. They might be 13% when we start, but not when we finish.
That's what the calculation's based off, 13%?
The yield is based on 13% moisture beans, but when you haul it across the elevator, you lose that water weight and you lose that yield. And then the second is harvest loss. We know that even the best combine tweaked right is going to lose about 3% of your yield between, you know, ahead of the combine, behind the combine. So I usually assume about a 5% harvest loss in there. So you have a 5% harvest loss, a reduction in moisture of 3%. Take that down, you get 46 bushels an acre.
We did it in one spot. Ideally, how many would you like to do within a field?
I would like to see at least 3 representative spots across the field, and representative this year can be kind of hard with the variability. You have a pothole that drowned it out. I have some good areas. So do the best you can, but getting several spots in the field, that's the advantage to this method. It's a little bit quicker. Just doing that 1/10,000th of an acre versus 1/1000th of an acre is that you can get more spots in the field.
And the final question, how much time is it going to take you if you do the 3 representative?
Yeah, it's going to take you probably about an hour per field to do this start to finish, to get several spots in the field and do these counts.
On the Market Journal website, you can find links to more resources on estimating soybean yields, including an Excel spreadsheet that will allow you to quickly plug in numbers for a final yield estimate. Next week, Nathan will explain how to estimate corn yields before harvest. The nation's top 18 corn growers currently list a fifth of their corn as mature, 6 points off the average. That trend holds in Nebraska, where 12% is mature, 4 points behind normal. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says stalk rot is now appearing in some fields and could cause problems during harvest.
Well, we're starting to see a few stalk rot issues, and so if people see a few plants starting to turn colors early before the rest of the field, it would be worth a trip out to check and see if they're having some stalk rot or crown rot issues, and especially the crown rot because that's where we're seeing the decay down in the root ball below ground. We'll check for stalk rots by using a push or a pinch test to check for the strength of the stalk, and that'll give you an idea if they're prone to lodging. Any plant stress is going to lead to stalk rot, and so this year where we've had a lot of leaf diseases or where we've had a lot of ponding in fields, and especially the taller hybrids that people have complained about this year with higher ears, all of these are going to be more likely to have stalk rots, and so we recommend checking that. If you find you have quite a few stalks that are thin or prone to lodging, I would consider harvesting those fields first or even a little earlier than normal to try to get them out before we have any lodging events. In addition to stalk rot diseases, we're also beginning to see a few ear rot diseases too. And not a whole lot just yet. We're not sure to what extent. This is primarily Diplodia ear rot that likes the wet conditions. So if you see the ear husk beginning to discolor early, be sure and get in there and husk those back. Take a look at the kernels and look for fungal growth. And remember, if you do have a lot of it and you harvest that and put it in the bin, it will continue to grow. And so we recommend letting it dry down to less than 15% if possible and cooling it off as quickly as possible to slow down that growth.
Tamra says there's not a whole lot that can be done to prevent stalk rot in the future. She says hybrid selection can help in some cases, but overall the important point is to reduce plant stress. The September Nebraska Farmer says Mark Miles and Brian Palm, 2 LEAD 34 fellows, have put the values and leadership skills they learned in the Nebraska LEAD program to work in a big way. This summer they donated and delivered 6 feeder steers to animal science students in the Chicago High School for Agricultural Sciences. Their goal was to help urban students learn more about real-life animal husbandry. To read more about the experiences of the Chicago High School students learning about agriculture, you can check out the September Nebraska Farmer. The latest state report shows the 4th cutting of alfalfa in Nebraska is 41% complete, 11 points ahead of the state's 5-year average. We mentioned earlier this summer, rain may have changed the quality of hay across Nebraska, and even for producers purchasing hay. Nebraska Extension's Berger says sampling and testing the forage is the only way to accurately know its nutritive value. At the Goodmanson Sandhills lab recently, we talked with Aaron about the importance of sampling forages before feeding them this fall or winter.
So this year we've had a lot of good moisture in Nebraska, a lot of forage around, but a lot of that forage has been rained on, or not the quality we would like in terms of getting put up. So as we think about the fall and we think about feeding that hay, going out and getting some samples can really help us analyze what we have in terms of quality. It's really important to understand where you're at, and just taking the numbers you had from last year, probably not a good thing as we think about the quality you got this year.
How much can the nutrients differ, or what's in the forage differ?
Yeah, it can really differ significantly from year to year. You can differ from portions in terms of how you got the hay put up. One field next to the other can differ, and so testing individual fields, testing them by each cutting, if you're multiple cuttings, is the way you need to do that.
How do you make sure you get a representative and adequate sample?
Yeah, so when we think about sampling hay, we want to make sure we do get a representative sample. I think we want to look at the lot of hay we have available. We want to number the bales and then maybe take every 4th bale or every 5th bale so we get a good accurate sample of what's there. And we also want to take more samples than what we might need. So just going out and getting 1 or 2 bales and say, oh, that's enough for the sample, that's not really what we want to do. We want to get 15, 20 samples, mix those all together, get a good mix, and then get a representative sample out of that to really get an accurate handle on what we have.
You send the sample in, you get the analysis back. Now how do you read it?
Yeah, so when we think about samples in terms of forages, first things I think about when we think about quality is crude protein, and then TDN, which stands for total digestible nutrients, which is a measure of energy. We have some good resources on the beef website that explain how to read those. They'll be reported back to you on an as received and then as a dry matter basis. We want to look at those feeds on a dry matter basis, which takes out the moisture and gives us a true understanding of what the value is there.
Anything else we should be testing for?
Yeah, so another thing we want to think about when we're testing forages is if we're doing anything with annual forages, nitrates is something we want to get a handle on. And so again, thinking about where those bales are in the field. If you know you have some portions of the field that you think could be higher in nitrate, I'd recommend maybe sampling some bales from those areas first. But that's, again, a simple test, but we want to get an accurate sample. The challenge a little bit with nitrate testing is that we can have some real variation within a field. And so trying to identify what we say maybe those hot spots first, testing those is helpful. Another thing, if we're thinking about harvesting annual forages as we get into this later part of the year, I encourage people to actually take a nitrate sample in the field before they go and cut it. We can do some things from a management standpoint to minimize that if we have some nitrates. Things like raising the cutter bar. Nitrates are going to be concentrated in the bottom third of the stem. We can maybe wait a little bit, hopefully that those nitrates will dissipate. Just some things we have some options if we know ahead of time.
Are there ways you know which areas of the field might be in high risk for nitrates?
Yeah, so I think it's really challenging to know if we have any drought stress or if we have any areas where maybe we were applying some manure or other nutrients where we have a lot more growth. Sometimes that can be, to be quite candid, it can really vary. And sometimes you just don't know. A field that you think would not have any problem comes out that you need to do something from a management standpoint because it's hotter than we'd like it to be. On the other hand, I've seen some times where we had stressed fields, thought, boy, that would be a good candidate, and it comes out fine. So the only way to know is test, and that's the only way you can get accurate knowledge of what you got.
As Aaron mentioned, UNL's beef website contains more resources on sampling and testing forages, including a recent article Aaron authored on the topic. We'll link to that information on the Market Journal website. The first look at corn harvest completion will come in Monday's USDA Crop Progress Report. Before growers begin storing this year's crops, Nebraska Extension entomologist Bob Wright says there are some precautions they can take to help ensure the grain stays in good quality. We talked with Bob earlier this week to learn why producers need to prevent insects from harming their stored products.
Well, there's a couple of different types of insects that can damage stored grain. There's several different types of grain beetles, and there's some caterpillars that also feed on grain. And so there's a variety of different insects that can cause problems if we're not aware of them.
So before harvest, what should growers be doing?
Well, it's really important that you clean out the bins now. Get all the old grain out from both the bins, grain trucks, anything, and the augers, anything you used to move grain last year. Potentially, if it has old grain in it, there could be insects feeding on that. That'll start a new infestation when you add the new grain in.
So you're saying all the grain or most of the grain?
Well, ideally, it's a lot better if you can clean out all the grain and get it all cleaned out. You'll have less insect problems. If for some reason you do need to leave old grain in the bin, it's generally recommended that you fumigate the old grain to kill any insects, and that can be a rather hazardous practice, and most growers probably aren't trained to do that, so you probably want to hire that out to a professional fumigator.
You're talking about if you would leave the bin a quarter or a half full or something like that, if you wouldn't clean it out entirely.
Right.
Are there signs of damage that you can be looking for other than specifically just insects that you might see?
Well, most of these insects will cause some damage to the grain, so there'll be dust. If it's in the case of the caterpillars, there may be webbing on the surface or cake grain from the insect feeding in the past years.
Is it important to differentiate how long you plan to store this grain based off of what treatments or what things you need to do now?
Right. If you're planning on storing for more than a year, you really need to be careful to start off with clean grain because the insects will have a longer time to build up. So definitely even if you're starting with a clean bin, it's often recommended to fumigate before you add new grain if you're planning to store it for a year or longer.
How important ventilation and temperature control?
Yeah, that's the other thing. You want to check your fans as well and make sure they're working before you start adding the grain so you can ventilate and get the temperature down quickly after harvest, and that can help reduce insect problems.
The North Central Integrated Pest Management Center features more resources on preparing bins for harvest. We'll link to that on the Market Journal website. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, of course, we've seen the warm temperatures during the Labor Day weekend, particularly Saturday and Sunday. Seen the development of thunderstorm activity across portions of east central Nebraska, primarily the Lincoln to Omaha metropolitan area, where we've seen heavy precipitation up to 5 inches fall in eastern Lincoln. And then, of course, we've seen redevelopment as we got into Monday night across southeast Nebraska, primarily impacting Saline, Thayer, and Gage County with heavy precipitation and significant hail. And then we've seen the reformation of thunderstorm activities. We had another cold front trying to work its way from the northern plains through the state on Wednesday and Thursday. Most of the thunderstorm activity in central Nebraska did leave some large hail and some localized heavy precipitation, and the reformation of that again on Thursday hit some of the same areas and then progressed eastward. Unfortunately, as you move toward the west of this region, we didn't see much in the way of any moisture of substantial proportions, and therefore there's been an upgrade in the drought monitor to abnormally dry conditions, expanding beyond the previous week to include a substantial portion of the Panhandle, southwest and south central Nebraska. So let's take a look at that latest drought monitor map, and you can see that we have seen this increase in dry conditions, and we would expect further increase depending on how the precipitation goes over this next 4 or 5 days. Most of it expected to be east of this region, so I would not be surprised if we'll see this upgraded toward most of the Panhandle, and also seen it starting to encroach in portions of western Kansas and eastern Colorado, as this dry signal has now been fairly well established for the last 4 to upwards of 8 weeks, depending on location within this area. Now, in terms of the pattern, we had this trough that brought the cold air into our region. It's now moved to the east of us, so we got a large north flow in eastern Nebraska. Very cool conditions expected, particularly as you're going to the game this evening. We expect to see temperatures dropping well into the lower 60s and possibly even the upper 50s before the end of the game. But we will see this break down rather rapidly. So as we go into tomorrow, we're going to see that trough lifting rapidly toward the northeast, and we're going to see more of a zonal flow. So that's going to bring some warmer temperatures into the western part of the state, just a slight bump up of temperatures in eastern Nebraska, but overall fairly dry conditions for this week. And The real activity starts to get in earnest as we get into Monday, as we start to see a storm system moving in the Pacific Northwest. That's slowly going to make its way toward the Central Plains. So in advance of it, there is some chances for some isolated thunderstorm activity along the Front Range of Colorado, and possibly even some nocturnal thunderstorm activity in extreme north, southeast, and east central Nebraska as we get into late Monday night and into early Tuesday morning. So as we get into the first day of Husker harvest days, we see this trough approaching. We're going to have a southwest flow at the surface, so we're going to see much warmer temperatures in our region. Really right now there's not pointing to any precipitation outside of an absolute extremely isolated event across southeast Nebraska. But as we get into Wednesday, this system starts to approach the northern plains, and we see some energy moving in through the bottom of this trough, primarily impacting the eastern half of the state. So from essentially Grand Island east, where there's a robust chance for precipitation, west of there more isolated. As we get into Thursday, we see that that trough tries to drop a little bit farther toward the south, but most of the energy remains to our north, so it looks like most of the precipitation will remain in eastern Nebraska. And as we get into Friday, that system drops even colder conditions in the northern plains and starts to work its way toward Iowa. So we would expect a significant cool down as we get into next weekend. As we look at the temperature forecast, we are remaining consistently in the upper 80s, so 90s across the western part of the state, cooling as we go through the week, particularly in the Thursday and Friday regime as we move down into the upper 70s and low 80s. In terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, warm air moves to our east from Thursday through the following Tuesday. And in terms of precipitation, we see an increase of significant moisture across a substantial portion of the central United States.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, estimating soybean yields, testing forages, and preparing bins for harvest. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, we'll report from Husker Harvest Days, where John Moret will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.